So, welcome to this overview of the books I've been reading so far in June, July, August. I don't know exactly when I started reading these books. It's a rough outline of basically the summer reads so far. I've been reading mostly history and, a focus on the 20th century and the far right, and then combined with some political theory. I've also been reading a little bit of philosophy and some literature, although it's only one book, but quite a massive book. Let's start. I started off my readings with The First Fascist. Now this book, as you can imagine, gives the outline of the pre-fascist. And it focuses on the life and the legacy of Marquis de Morès, which is he was a French fascist. So that's already quite interesting. Because it's not a stereotypical it's not been seen as a stereotypical fascist country. But yeah, the book focuses on his life and legacy. And, you can debate to what extent he is a pre-fascist. I mean, the definition that's used in the book is mostly a focus on populism, on anti-Semitism, and on the use of a paramilitary force. There is also a bit of colonialism in there. Marquis de Morès goes to Asia and to the US to get his wealth there. There is a bit of a colonial tendency there as well. What I really liked about the book is the focus on symbolism, also by de Morès. So there's a real tendency to describe the fascist movement in the usage of symbolism and colors and going back to certain historical rituals or symbols to show a continuation with the past and the fatherland. So that was really interesting. That was really nicely done. I think the risk of this book was mostly in its definition. If you buy in with the definition provided by the author, then the book is very interesting. You can debate about it. But I thought it was quite an enjoyable read, especially since it's a microhistory, only focused on one character. It was very neatly done, and it was a very enjoyable read. Then I went into two books I read simultaneously together. Those were a history book and a more, I would say, polemical philosophy book, namely Fire and Blood, the European Civil War, and The Dark Continent, Europe's 20th Century. Now, I started reading The Dark Continent to give me a little bit of context on Fire and Blood. I saw the 20th century as a century that has been characterized by two civil wars and a Cold War. And Fire and Blood makes the argument that no, actually the 20th century is filled by a civil war that ranges from the start of the First World War to the end of the Second World War. And it argues that, for example, the Spanish Civil War and the Russian Civil War, the Finnish Civil War, each of them drew in partisans from all over the continent and polarized people between those who are anti-fascists and those who are fascists. Now, Traverso also considers the liberal Democrats in all these countries. However, Traverso quickly comes to the conclusion that the liberal Democrats either gave up on their principles and gave themselves over to the fascists, collaborated with them, or joined the anti-fascists, but weren't a force to be reckoned with on their own. In The Dark Continent, this is expanded on a little bit more elaborately, with a specific focus on the fragility of the democracies at the end of the 19th century and the start of the early 20th century. Really zooming in on the population, in different European countries all over the continent, what they thought of fascism, how they looked at liberal democracies and parliamentarianism, and that they often looked quite favorably at several fascist states and leaders, and that actually this century could have been a lot different did things not work out the same way as they did in the last century. It really nicely depicted the fragility of our current democracies and the violence that has occurred all over the last century, not only during these two wars, but throughout the whole century, and that our democracies were at risk, both at the start of the 20th century and in the build-up again after the Second World War. So, a nice recommendation to read them together. I think they very well supplement each other. Then I went over to Hitler's American Model. Now, the United States and the Making of Nazi Race Law. Now, this book I was a little bit disappointed with, and that's all on me, sadly. The book focuses mainly on law, and it looks at the American legislation and how that inspired the Nazis. I am not that big of a law fanatic. I think it can be very interesting. It was still an interesting read. It was still interesting to see that there were certain laws in the United States that the Nazis considered too extreme. It was still interesting to read through the collaboration between the two countries, and that was fascinating. But there were, in my opinion, other things that could have been more interesting. So, for example, not only the laws, but also how, for example, racial segregation was materialized and, for example, shared within the culture. That could have also been interesting to see. Basically the overlap between the two countries. That's not discussed in this book. It's only law. And it's my mistake that I did not pick that up, but that made this book a little bit disappointing. Then I'm going into another book that was quite a bit disappointing, namely a book that I got for my birthday, The Nature of Identitarianism. Now, I've read quite some interesting articles by research institutes in the Netherlands that focused on the collaboration between the United States, Russia, and different identitarian groups in Europe. And I thought it would be great to catch up and expand my knowledge on what forms these groups, basically what their ideology is, and what drives them. And so I picked up the best academic book that I could find. It was terrible. It is. Look, I think what happened is that the author, who is extremely knowledgeable on the topic, even interviewed quite some identitarianists himself, namely, for example, Dugin in Russia, which I think is very interesting. And he has it's clear from the book that he has a wealth of knowledge that he puts from. I mean, I can list some of the content that he discusses. So, for example, he talks about core ideas in identitarianism, and it's not only anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, but he also goes deep into various conspiracy theories, like on Freud, on let me check again. The protocols of the Elders of Zion, on secret societies like the Knights Templars and the Rosicrucians, the Freemasons, the Turner Diaries, David Icke. He goes in all the way. It's very interesting, but the book itself is written so badly. There are so many mistakes in the grammar, in how sentences are built, that it's just impossible to follow. And that was really devastating, because it's also quite an expensive book, and I could have asked at least 2 other books for the price of this one. So, not a huge recommendation. Then I went through the Doctrines of Fascism by Mussolini and Gentile. Now, I don't really know what to say about this. It's difficult to rate a manifesto on fascism. I think what stood out to me is the focus on faith and the focus on religion. So Mussolini and Gentile really draw upon or make parallels between what they see to be the core of fascist ideology, or, well, basically they make a parallel between fascist ideology and its movement, what it should mean for people, and religious societies. And so there's an emphasis on faith, there's an emphasis on rituals, there's an emphasis on coming together for the purpose of one single goal and forming a unity around that goal, which I thought was extremely interesting. I also thought it was quite interesting to read how Mussolini, at the start of the manifesto, immediately says, well, fascism is an ideology not only of action but also of thought, and really tries to do its best to set out what then exactly forms those thoughts. And so that is contrary to, for example, well, no, that's just interesting. So, yeah, I mean, small little book. Wouldn't call it a recommendation, but for anyone interested in the far right and trying to figure out what forms its ideology, definitely an interesting small little read. Then, in connection to, I would say, the Dark Continent and the European Civil War, is Exterminate All Brutes. Now, this book does something neat, which is it tries to find the ideological groundings of, for example, fascism and the Holocaust, but it tries to find that in colonial history. So, for example, you can think of Aimé Césaire, who did a similar thing, and who coined the boomerang theory. So, the boomerang theory basically argues that the ideologies and the mechanisms that we saw during the fascist rise in the 20th century were developed during the colonial period by imperialistic colonial powers, but turned inwards to their own countries and their own people quite often. Now, this book makes that theory a bit more, basically argues for the same theory, but does so in a bit of a novel way by describing how the author goes around various countries, describes his journey through those countries, but also ties in these different connections to, the history of these ideologies. And it was really nicely done. I think the only thing that makes me give this book, for example, 4 stars instead of a 5, is the fact that he draws upon both, his own journey, the ideologies, and then its history, but then also ties it in with various historical figures, like, for example, Joseph Conrad, the writer of the Heart of forgot the name. But yeah, that makes it sometimes, the Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad. But that makes it sometimes a bit difficult to follow along. But overall, great read. Then another book I got for my birthday is The New Fascist Body. Now, this book does also something very interesting, and I feel like I keep repeating myself in that sense, but I've just been reading quite some interesting books. But it looks at how fascists, both, and with a focus on Germany, so that's important to say, so it focuses on the Nazi parties and the AfD right now. Don't know if you can call the whole party fascist. I mean, I should be careful with that terminology, but it draws upon fascist ideology, and when talking about the Nazis, and then makes the comparison to the AfD, and looks specifically into how both share very similar opinions and very similar frameworks when talking about sexuality and disability, and how both are connected. And I just thought that was very interesting. It is, sexuality is often discussed upon when discussing far-right parties and fascist ideologies. Disability, a bit less, but then the connection between those two, so the striving for a healthy body, a pure population, ties in these two. And also how, for example, eroticism and desire can be used upon by parties, not only to drive fear, so for example, think of the contaminating immigrant that is trying to well, our word, our girls and our women, but also how, for instance, eroticism can be used to instead um, highlight the great tolerance within a country and how free we are and how that should be protected. So think of, well, think of, for example, pictures of people on a beach in a bikini and then being threatened by a burqa. So those are examples that are drawn upon in this book. It's highly interesting. It's a big recommendation, especially, well, in general. It's just a short, fascinating read, so go for it. Then, this one was also one that I got for my birthday, which is Disaster Nationalism, The Downfall of Liberal Democracy, or sorry, Liberal Civilization, by Richard Seymour. Now, this one was so close to getting a lot of stars. This one was so close, but it didn't get it. Because the book starts off by saying, look, we can't just draw upon fascist theory from the 20th century because fascism is developing. And the fascist theories or fascists of the 20th century are not the same as the fascists now. So what do? Well, he coins disaster nationalism as a sort of proto-new fascist theory. So it's a theory that, that can develop into fascism. So disaster nationalism can develop into fascism, but it's before that, and it's more focused on our current century and its novelties. However, disaster nationalism itself is only very broadly defined, very broadly, and then you get a lot of chapters that delve into, well, that sometimes give a little bit of a hint towards what then actually disaster nationalism is, but it doesn't ever concretely define it. And that's just frustrating, because you keep just pulling at straws and you don't know exactly how the information of the book is going to help you because the definition is lacking. I thought that was pretty frustrating, and it made it a less enjoyable read so far. Well, not so far, I finished it. It just made it a less enjoyable read, and that's too bad, because the author, similarly as the nature of Identitarianism, is so knowledgeable and draws upon so many sources from sociology, political theory, philosophy, and more, and history, of course. But yeah, sadly, without a definition and a proper structuring of the rest of the book that can sort of guide why this definition is chosen, or, well, yeah, where you're going with the book, it just doesn't work. So sadly, not really a recommendation. I'm going to put on some lights and then I'm going to switch to the rest of the 4 books that I've been reading. Now with a little bit of light to help us through the video. The first book I then want to discuss is Against Identity, The Wisdom of Escaping the Self by Alexander Douglas. Now this book, I had a bit of difficulties with. I don't know what to rate this book. Not that you necessarily should rate a book, but, you know, look, what it does is it makes an argument against identity politics and against identity in the broader sense, and does so by building on 3 thinkers that over the centuries have argued against identity. He does so by building on Zhuangzi, I am again butchering the name probably, Spinoza, and René Girard. Now, what I think bothers me a little bit with the book, look, the argument is very nicely done, the outline works, it works. But what bothers me a little bit is the fact that, well, for example, at the end of the book he makes an argument that one of the things holding us back from, for example, raising us from austerity is the fact that people hold very tightly onto their identities and that contrary theories are then put down. So, for example, individuals that have amazing new ideas are getting put down because we hold on very tightly towards our identities. I don't know if I fully agree with that. Another thing is, well, look, maybe that's my sociology background and the focus on materialist backgrounds, materialist situations that reinforce our. Never mind. Look, I struggled with that a little bit. I also lacked a critical note. So, for example, he doesn't really build on contrary philosophers, for example, like Hegel, that do emphasize identities, which I think is, it weakens the case a little bit. And underlying the whole book, I read a bit of look, both sides are quite bad, and both sides focus on identity, and identity itself is a little bit of a bad thing, because look at the culture wars, and I am above that. I know that's just vibes. That isn't really the best, the best way to recommend or not recommend a book, but that made it so that I struggled a little bit with the book. Overall, an enjoyable read. Give it a try. It's clear that Alexander Douglas really understands and has struggled with these three thinkers and wove them together in a extremely nice way, which is can only be looked upon with great respect. It might just have not been my book. Then I went through a couple of letters. So, Letters from a Stoic by Seneca. Some were quite nice, some were a little bit boring. I really liked the letters on the gladiators, on what his opinions were on having slaves. I liked his letters on death. I enjoyed his letters on, for example, friendship. Others were very boring and sometimes a little bit pretentious, but I think it was interesting. Then, sadly, I wouldn't want to call it a disappointment, because that's unfair, it's mostly on me, but that's The Book of Jacobs by Olga Tokarczuk. Now look, I was drawn in. I mean, mysticism, it's a historical novel, it goes into Kabbalah, so Jewish mysticism, it has a religious a sort of a religious war, well, not a war, but a religious divide that tears up the Jewish community, and especially in Poland. It goes into a sect formed surrounding Jacob Frank. Jacob Frank is actually a real historical figure. That's the main character of this book, and the book focuses mainly on his rise and the eventual fall of his cult and him. It just didn't draw me in. It took around 200 pages to finally introduce Jacob Frank. There are a lot of side characters that make the book quite hard to follow. Moreover, around halfway through the book, most of the important characters who are Jewish become Catholic and then switch their names, which made it even more difficult to follow along with the book. So it was tough. It took a lot from me. And at a certain point, I gave myself 60 pages every day during the vacation as a maximum. And at the end of those pages, I was just happy to put the book away because I couldn't get through it. And in that sense, it was disappointing, because I think the themes were neat, the themes were interesting, the character development is always amazing. Look, Olga did also what she did really well, which I really enjoyed, was taking us. Building our perspective on Jacob through the very intimate framework of his closest companions, and that was really nicely done and very interesting, but I just couldn't really get through it, and that is mostly on me, probably, because I've read a lot of good reviews, and it is also it won the English Pen Award, and not only that, but Olga is a great writer. I've enjoyed The Empusium and also Drive Your Plow Over the Dead Bones. Drive Your Plow Over the Bones of the Dead, which were both amazing. So maybe this just wasn't the book for me. And then lastly, I've read through Galileo's Error, The Foundations for a New Science of Consciousness. Now this I would characterize as an introductory book on the philosophy of mind. and the three main frameworks that form this philosophy. So that is dualism, materialism, and panpsychism. And then the author, Philip Goff, actually does a pretty neat job of arguing for panpsychism, which is the theory that argues that the foundation of our universe is consciousness. And am I interested by the idea? Absolutely. Will I read more upon it or on it? Yes, for sure. Is my knowledge or am I an expertise? Do I have an expertise on the philosophy of mind and metaphysics? No. So can I very concretely argue against or in favor of panpsychism? No, but I'm absolutely interested and I will definitely read more. So, yeah, Galileo's Error. Huge recommendation, very interesting. Those were the books for this, basically the last 3 months, I would say, a little bit more, a little bit less. I've enjoyed it. I've been enjoying my read so far. I am now also without any concrete books that I will pick up. So recommendations are always welcome, also based on the list that I've discussed. If you have any tips or books that I should really pick up, let me know. But yeah, that's it so far. Always feel free to reach out on Goodreads, on Instagram, through my mail. I'm always very happy to hear from any of you, and I am aiming to pick up again on this channel. So yeah, see you later.